Trade with China during this period, however, was not just trade. You didn't simply exchange goods for other goods and pay money for them in exactly the same way that modern trading houses do, that modern import-export firms do. Trade with China came with many political and even ideological strings attached. We have to consider the traditional Chinese view of foreign relations in order to understand exactly how these contacts between Japan and China functioned. China was a state and a political culture that was very old. That went back well into the first millennium BCE and was considerably older than China. And the Chinese emperors had consolidated their rule of China over what we think today as China much earlier than the Japanese imperial family had. And they developed essentially a Sino-centric view of the world. And this was a view that China, and specifically the Chinese emperor, was the source of all civilization. The Chinese monarchy was viewed as a universal monarchy. It was a monarchy that should really rule the entire world. That by virtue of their virtue and of their culture, the Chinese emperors were literally the source of civilization. And this old Chinese map, I think, really renders this this worldview visually very, very well. This is, well, I mean, it looks, frankly, it looks like the head of Donald Trump, the President of the United States. That is, I assure you that that's not what it is. This is a representation of, roughly speaking, what we would today consider Asia, Europe, Africa, India. This great landmass, with China right here in the center. This is, I believe, the Yellow River. This is, I believe, the Yangtze River. Other rivers, and I think this is this is basically Africa right here. But China is in the center. And why is it in the center? Because that's where civilization comes from. That's where the Chinese imperial family is. And then the farther away one gets from the center, the weirder and stranger the world becomes. Close countries like Korea are represented as more or less where they actually are, and this is Japan right here. But really, if you look at this map, you notice that it's not really meant to be geographically accurate. It's meant to convey a world view rather than an accurate pictorial representation of land masses and political borders. You will see as you move farther and farther along, you go from Korea and Japan, places that you know actually exist if you're Chinese, to really strange places depicted as just signs in the middle of the ocean or in some undifferentiated landmass, way over there somewhere, roughly speaking. There are things like countries where people walk on two hands, islands where giants live, the country of women, things like that. And really, nobody really much cares if there are actually, if there is actually any accurate information about any of these places, or indeed whether or not they exist, because they're completely beyond the pale of civilized influence. Let's look at this chart to help us make sense of this map, right? Here is the Chinese government in the center. And as virtue, as civilization diffuses out from it, you then go and people who are traditionally considered Chinese, the so-called Han people, the Chinese themselves, one of the terms of the Chinese for themselves was the people of the black hair. Then you incorporate other outlying parts of China where you have various minority populations, and that is the area, roughly this yellow area, this is the area that is controlled by the imperial court politically. Then there's this green area. And this green area is fascinating. This is an area of so-called tributary states. The way that the Chinese government conducted foreign relations was they didn't necessarily see trade and diplomacy as separate things. What you were expected to do if you were a ruler of an outlying kingdom, and the Koreans did do this, for example, was to you were expected to send emissaries to the Chinese court, acknowledging the superiority of China, acknowledging your country's subordinate position vis-a-vis the Chinese court, and essentially acknowledging the Chinese emperor as your overlord. Right? So far it kind of sounds like what Kublai Khan tried to get the Hojo to do before invading them in the late 13th century. The difference is that if you acknowledge the primacy of the Chinese emperor, you actually gain quite a lot. You become a tributary state in name, yes, but you get endowed with the title of king. There is one emperor, there's only one emperor, only one son of heaven ruling over in China. But there can be many kings, and the Chinese emperor, by virtue of claiming universal authority over all human political events on the entire earth, claims the authority to invest the heads of tributary states with this title of king. You also get a great deal of gifts. Your emissaries get a great deal of gifts, usually much more than the tribute gifts which you yourself sent with your dignitaries to tell the Chinese emperor how grand he was. You also get access to Chinese markets, and you also get Chinese military protection in many ways. The Mongols did inherit this system of thinking. They also were very keen on telling people from one end of their empire to go march in grand military campaigns in different parts of their empire. Native Chinese dynasties really did not do this. And so it was, in one way, to enter into this tributary relationship was in one way acknowledging your inferiority to the Chinese, but in another way it was gaining security, and it was gaining a great many benefits. And of course, you know, you call yourself a subordinate of the Chinese in front of the Chinese emperor, but then when you get back home, as Korean kings did, for example, you then are the law of the land, and really your peasants are rather indifferent to the fact that you claimed as the Korean king that you are subordinate to some ruler out there in China. It was a great way, in many respects, to to borrow the prestige of the Chinese imperial family to enhance your own, but it was also not completely without its downsides, because if there are people, elites or nobles, for example, who do take exception with you being a kind of a Chinese imperial appointee, they might use this as an opportunity to raise trouble against you, and there was a certain degree of loss of face by acknowledging yourself to be a subordinate. But for somebody like Yoshimitsu, whose authority in Japan was derived, as we've seen, from military success, from cultural influence, from economic power, somebody who was a very able administrator, somebody who traveled the country, made his vassals obey his commands, this kind of arrangement would seem safe, because not only were you already in control of your country when you sent an embassy to the Chinese court, as Yoshimitsu did, and was invested with the title of King of Japan, you now had preferential access to Chinese markets, and you could also rest secure knowing that the Chinese were not going to have any problem with you ruling in Japan, and might actually back you up in case there was any trouble. So Yoshimitsu essentially inserted Japan into this Sino-centric world order and used this to great effect. This is a picture of a Muromachi-era boat. This is actually a riverboat. Nothing like this would ever have sailed to China, but plenty of Japanese boats did, and there was a flood of Chinese goods, Chinese techniques, artistic techniques, sometimes techniques for things like making pottery, for growing tea, and also pottery and tea and all sorts of other materials from China as well, that really helped make Kyoto even more a center of culture. Yoshimitsu and these official Japanese envoys were not the only Japanese to make contact with China. However, there was also a problem, especially as Ashikaga power waned after the period of their supremacy was kind of over or approaching its end. There was a great uptick of piracy. There was a great amount of trade, as we've just talked about, and this trade was very attractive to many local samurai who lived on the coasts of Japan, because they could just take it in many cases. The lords of places like Tsushima, right here, that island that the Mongols landed on and killed all of the samurai on earlier on, that traditional meeting place of Japan and Korea, this was controlled by the So family, who became powerful pirate lords. The Murakami family, whose crest is right here, used to control a great deal of maritime territory in the inland sea, this central hub of Japanese shipping here, and many of these samurai kind of went into business for themselves. Many coastal communities fed recruits into these essentially pirate establishments, and the problem of piracy really became a thorn in the side of China, but also of Korea and some other governments in Southeast Asia as well. These pirates, in the Chinese sources and in the Korean sources, are referred to as Japanese pirates. The Japanese word for that is wako, and these, here is a wonderful, wonderful description or pictorial depiction of these wako battling Chinese troops. They had the image of being all Japanese. They were not all Japanese. Many of them were Chinese, many of them were Koreans, many of them came from, for example, the Ryukyu Islands or other parts of East Asia, but so many of these pirate bases were in Japan that they became known as Japanese pirates. There were two distinct phases of wako activity during the Muromachi period. The earlier period, they targeted Korea and North China, and then basically in the 16th century they switched their attention, during the Warring States period they switched their attention to southern and central China, and the Chinese government, the Korean government, had to take really serious precautions against them, and it was really not until the Tokugawa family and, well, maybe a little earlier, but in any case, it wasn't until powerful Japanese warlords imposed their authority over Western Japan in the late 16th and early 17th century that this problem really went away. The Muromachi shoguns, Yoshimitsu was more successful at dealing with piracy. Some of the other more powerful, his immediate descendants, were able to keep more or less a lid on these guys. But as time went on, piracy became a more serious problem, and in many ways undermined the effectiveness of the Muromachi Bakufu itself, and certainly embittered the Chinese and the Koreans, and the Chinese emperors especially were very, very unpleased by the fact that people who paid them tribute in earlier generations, like Yoshimitsu, and were invested with the title of King of Japan, the Chinese emperors were very displeased that their descendants could no longer control even their own vassals, who were outfitting pirate raids and hitting all of these Chinese cities, and in many cases, in Korean cities, and in many cases causing a great amount of damage.